or energy that remains the same in the earth. Okay, so matter probably can be converted into energy. One form of energy might be converted into another form of energy, and theoretically, maybe energy can also be converted into matter, which is actually not possible. Practical application of that is very limited. But the fact is that the total amount of matter and energy in the system that remains the same. Of course, if we look into it's applicable for the closed system. So where, of course, in the Earth cannot be considered to be completely, totally a closed system. Because some of the energy that we use come as solar energy also. The sun contributes towards formation of some of the fossil fuels, of course, over a period of time. But otherwise, solar energy is another form which directly comes from the sun. And of course, we know that the amount of this type of energy that is being used by mankind as of now is much, much lesser. But the fact is that this can explain to some extent this law I am talking about, the materials balance principle, can talk about the amount of waste or maybe kind of environmental degradation as a result of economic activity. So these are the two implications that we often can talk about regarding the first law of thermodynamics. The first one is that since we know that matter cannot be destroyed, basically it means that if we extract more energy or more resources or more matter for production process, then obviously the waste will also be generated. And if more resources are extracted, then more waste might be generated, and everything will be dumped back into the environment itself. So that way, in fact, more economic activities means more waste being generated, and more environmental degradation. So that is one way of actually explaining, or maybe when the thinking about economic activities. So in essence, if we think about environmental quality, probably we have to think about kind of reduction of economic activities, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's, in fact, it's not possible. You see, urbanization is happening. It's part of economic process, economic growth, and population growth is happening. Obviously, it will happen. So for that, actually, demand will also be increasing. So for that, more economic activities will happen, and more economic activities will necessitate use of more of matter and energy, and that obviously will result in more of waste. So the issue might be, so how we can kind of make better use of the waste, how we can process the waste so that it doesn't contribute towards environmental degradation or reduction of the environmental quality. That probably is one of the issues out there. Secondly, some people feel that this law of thermodynamics also has some kind of link with the degree of substitutability of different resources. Normal circumstances, we talk about the different capital or maybe different resources which are required for production purposes. And in economics, we try to distinguish between different types of resources. For example, we talk about a man-made capital, so we talk about human capital, so those type of things. And these are kind of resources which are used for production purposes. And the issue is if the variability or substitutability between different factors of production is very less, then that basically means that we need to have these different types of resources in the environment. If it is lesser, then economic activities will suffer. That is the issue. So, so obviously that might put limits to growth as well. So that might contribute towards the limits to growth as well. Because many a time we feel that so we require any form of resource, but whether it is man-made capital or man-made resource, or whether it is human resource. But we know that only natural resource or man-made resource will not be sufficient to ensure some kind of growth. So we'll be requiring a combination of man-made resource, natural resource, and human resource. So we cannot probably compensate for the loss of natural resource by man-made resource, because the contribution of each of these resources will be important from the point of view of economic production or economic growth. So that is why, okay, so if there is very less a degree of substitutability between different factors of production, and we continue producing and growing the way we are growing as of now, then probably that will lead to kind of limits to growth, which was actually one of the apprehensions of the Club of Rome in the 1970s. So when they felt that the kind of economic activities that were happening were not in sync with the amount of resources that the earth was having at that point of time. So that way, in fact, the concept of sustainable development came into place over a period of time. The second law of thermodynamics, as you can see, is in the form of entropy law. So entropy basically means the kind of capacity of the energy resources to work once it is used. You can say like that. And the law might be stated in this form. In a closed system, the use of matter energy causes a one-way flow from low entropy resources to high entropy resources. Basically, it moves from order to disorder. Okay, so if we take an example, for example, use of energy, for example, once the energy source of energy is being used, okay, the capacity of that source of energy to do something will be reduced. That is the kind of nature of the entropy here, out here. So, for example, if we think about a fossil fuel, a piece of coal, once the piece of coal is burned, the heat in it is coming out. It dissipates into the air. Okay. So, what will happen? So, some of the heat probably might be captured in some kind of instrument. We can think about doing that, but maybe heat exchanger or something like that. But the fact is that it may not be possible for us to get back all the energy that is released from the piece of coal. That is obviously not possible out there. So, although we can talk about recycling of the resources or energy, but probably that will not help us that much. So, we will not be able to get back all the capacity of the original energy source. That is not possible. But so this will help us understanding the limits of matter energy recycling. So how much we can go for recycling of matter or energy because of this type of nature of the resource. And based on that, probably the policy are to be taken up. So probably that is one of the reasons, which is why the governments or maybe international agencies are giving a lot of emphasis on sustainable development nowadays, sustainable development goals. So where we have to think about method of production or maybe consumption in such a way that it doesn't actually it affects obviously the resources, no doubt, but it affects the resources in such a way that we can have something for the future generation as well. So basically, we are talking about intergenerational equity out here. The amount of kind of satisfaction or amount of resources that are needed for meeting our requirement or needs should also be equally available for the future generation. So kind of time dimension is involved in the process out here. So, so this is in a nutshell about the two laws, first and second law of thermodynamics, which might be considered to be associated with, which can be linked with the economy environment interaction from the point of view of our classes or maybe course here. So what I have done, I have consulted the book by Henley mostly. Actually, it's a joint publication with Jeff Sogren and Ben White. So there are two versions of the book. Actually, so they are having a number of different books in a sense, you can say so. One is an introduction to environmental economics, which was published way back in Oxford University Press. And the second one is titled as Environmental Economics in Theory and Practice. So there is a second revised edition of this book, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2006. From the point of view of readability, the second book is relatively better, but the first book also will be giving some ideas about the basic things that we are talking about in terms of interaction between the economic activities and environmental quality or environmental resources. I personally do not have the copy of the book, e-copy. I am talking about e-book. You try to find it out. Otherwise, I'll be sending you some of the materials for your reference. Okay. Once this is done, so I would like to move to the other unit, not unit exactly, the other topic. So other topic is basically in the form of market failure, which is a relatively bigger topic in the unit. I'll go back to that. I'll try to have a look at that. So the market, from the point of view of economics, is very important, and market plays a very important role in economic activities. So that is why we need to know how market behaves and what are its role overall. So we'll try to have a look at this. In the case of this particular course, we will be discussing, or we will be exploring the concept of market failure. Now, why market failure? There is a reason behind that. Basically, you see, for any kind of ordinary goods and services, so how much of the good is to be produced, and accordingly, how much of different resources are to be allocated for these goods and services are decided based on the market signal. And the market signal is in the form of demand and supply. Basically, the price will give the signal. So, in economics, we often talk about the demand curves and supply curves. So demand curve is a downward sloping curve. Normally, we talk about that. So which portrays the relationship between the price of the product and quantity demanded. So we assume a negative relationship between the price and quantity demanded. So at higher price, quantity demanded of the product is low, and at lower price, the quantity demanded of the same product might be a little bit more. So that way, in fact, the demand curve is a downward sloping curve. Whereas there is the concept of supply. If there is some demand, then obviously that is to be made, and that is made by providing the goods and services in the market. So there is a supply. Somebody supplies this produce. It might be by private seller, or it might be government institution, whatever that may be. Now this supply, if we go by market forces, so supply and price is considered to have a positive relationship. So basically, at lower level of price, the supplier will be interested to sell a little bit less, whereas at higher price, the supplier will be interested in selling more amount of the same produce. So that way, there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now, these demand and supply curve, one is the negatively sloped one, and the other one is the positively sloped one. So whenever they meet, they come to an equilibrium position. Equilibrium position basically means a kind of position. Once achieved, the forces will not try to change that position. That is an equilibrium position. Now here, in the case of market demand and supply, the equilibrium will mean that a certain quantity of produce will be sold and supplied, or maybe demanded by the consumers and the suppliers at a particular price. Okay. So this intersection between demand curve and supply curve will result in some equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. That basically means that at a price which is fixed because of the demand and supply interaction, so how much of quantity is required, so that will be decided. So in a sense, this market signal in the form of price will actually decide how much of resources are to be allocated for clearance of that amount in the market. So if the market forces give proper signal, then the best possible allocation of resources will be made in the market, and there will not be any kind of intervention for that. Of course, for the markets to operate properly, so there are a number of conditions out there, so which we need to look into. We'll be looking into some of them. For example, the sellers and the buyers should have proper information. There should not be any asymmetry of information. Kind of institutional arrangement for kind of ensuring the contract between the buyers and sellers, that should be good enough. Basically, we talk about legal system, and also there should not be any barrier in the form of kind of functioning of the market. So different forms of barriers are noticed in the case of markets. So these things should not be there. These are some of the conditions. If these conditions are available, then probably markets are expected to provide a good signal insofar as how much of goods or services are to be produced based on the available resources. Okay, so that way market works. But in the case of environmental resources, it so happens that market may not be giving the proper signal because of a number of reasons. So we'll try to see what are the situations in which this type of things happen. So that is our idea in this video. Okay. So market is considered to be an exchange institution which serves the society by organizing economic activity. Different types of economic activities might be there. So mostly we consider basic two sectors. One is the farm sector, and the other one is the household sector. In household sector, there might be kind of consumption activities. In the farm sector, there might be production activities. So those things might be there. Different types of production activities might be there. And so markets facilitate this type of economic activities. So some of the signals of market in the form of price, demand, supply, those things will operate properly to give the right signal in the market. Forces of demand and supply in equilibrium provide signals through price regarding output to be exchanged in a market. So as I have already mentioned about that, how much of the output is to be produced, and accordingly, how much of resources, I'm talking about raw materials or maybe other resources, will be used. So that will be decided by the market forces themselves, so provided certain preconditions exist out there. Okay. Now, of course, as I told you, there might be certain different barriers. So these barriers might be available in different types of markets. You see, right now, as you can see in India, there has been a lot of discussion about these farm bills, and the protests are still going on. So yesterday or day before yesterday, also I was talking about that. Now the issue is when you talk about this agricultural commodities, for example. Okay, so what happens? So we have a lot of small and marginal farmers in the country, and these small and marginal farmers are basically price taker farmers. Price takers means they do not have much influence on the price that is to be decided. So so they actually accept the price which is decided by the market, and at that price they try to sell the product. So that is actually a form of market which is known as perfectly competitive market. So there are different types of markets. One, perfect competition is there, monopolistic competition is there, oligopoly is there, duopoly is there, monopoly is there. So there are different types of market structures out there. In the case of agricultural market, as I was talking about the small and marginal farmers, there the market demand and market supply. So these are the macro forces in a sense. Macro concept, market demand and market supply means overall demand and overall supply we are talking about. So if we have number of people who will be having some demand for a particular product, so if we can sum up all the demands together at a particular price, we can find out the total demand for a product. Similarly, we can find out the total supply based on the summation of individual supplies of all the suppliers at a particular price. So we can have both the demand and supply. So this demand and supply will interact, and they will decide how much of total output of suppose of a particular agricultural product will be required in the market, and for that, what will be the price, equilibrium price, and that price will be taken up, will be considered by the individual farmer, and they have to sell the produce so that they will be producing at that price. So that way, in fact, they are price taker farmers, and that happens in a market structure called perfectly competitive market structure. So this is one extreme form, perfectly competitive market structure, where we find very large number of sellers in the market for the same product. Same product means I am talking about same product. So you cannot distinguish between the items sold by two different sellers. Normally, if we go to the market, we can distinguish between different products. Even if you pick up fruits, for example, apple, for example. So these apples might be differentiated by way of brand and other things. But in the case of perfectly competitive market structure, it is not something like that. In the case of apple market, for example, it might so happen that there will be some apples which might be coming from Himachal Pradesh, some might be coming from Kashmir Valley, and the shape might also be different. Some might be smaller, some might be bigger, something like that. So looking into those things, you can distinguish between the products sold by different sellers in the market. But in the case of perfectly competitive market structure, it's a homogeneous product. There is no, you cannot distinguish between the output sold by two different sellers. So this type of conditions are there. Perfectly competitive market structure is very, actually it involves large number of sellers. So if it is large number of sellers, then individual seller will not be in a position to influence the market price, because why it so happens is something like this. Suppose an individual seller, he will be having a very small fraction of the total output sold in the market. Now, if he tries to raise the price a little bit more, then since the product is homogeneous, other sellers will also be selling the same product at a lower price. So this particular seller will be losing all the customers because the same product is available at lesser price in a different seller. So that is the thing. So that's why individual seller will not be in a position to influence the price of the product. Okay, so that is one thing. And of course, there are other conditions which, of course, later on we can think of later on when it is required. Now, this is one form where the sellers cannot decide on the price. Rather, they have to accept the market price, which is decided by the interplay of the forces of demand and supply in the market. But if you look at the other extreme, you have monopoly market structure. So in the case of monopoly, everybody knows about monopoly. So if we ask you to give me one example of monopoly market, can you give me one monopoly example of monopoly market? Can anybody tell me?
Hello.
Are you listening or not?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's monopoly, but Geo is like basically defining on how the telecom market should work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Okay.
not. I'm because many like Airtel and other are there, but like currently Geo is the deciding factor. So I'm not sure it's monopoly, but just a guess. Guess.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good example. Yeah, that's a good example. May not be exactly absolute monopoly kind of a thing, but even then, you dominated the scenario, particularly in the case of 4G, and in fact, they dictated the terms and conditions. Of course, it's like a monopolist they behaved, but not exactly monopoly as such. But even then, your example is more or less correct. Any other example? Anybody else?
Coal India.
Coal India. Why Coal India?
It's the market leader.
Market
It
leader is
supplies
a
around,
different thing. I'm not talking about market leader. Is it the only
yeah,
actor in
around
the market?
80%. Yeah, around 80%.
No. Is it not 100%?
Not 100%,
If it is not
but absolutely.
100%, yeah. Actually, in the case of monopoly, no, so there should be only one provider. Okay. So, for example, I can give you a classic example. Till now, of
Hello,
course,
sir.
it may not be the only one, of course. Yeah. Anyone else?
I mean, for one time, Microsoft was performing monopoly over the computer systems market. I mean, the time where when Apple didn't become so big.
Okay. Yeah. That's true. Similarly, you can think about one Indian example. Actually, it's not in the industry as such. It's in a service. In fact, till few years back, it was the only one. I'm talking about Indian Railways. Indian Railways. It was in the hand of the government, right? In the transportation sector, railway transportation sector, it was the government railways or government railway department which provided the railways or maybe kind of the services. So that's why it was a monopoly. Okay, of course, there are certain conditions why this type of monopolies emerge. So this is in the government sector, but in the private sector, if it so happens that only one provider is there, then obviously that will create a lot of issues out there, right? In the case of government, of course, things are a little bit different because there are many conditions. First of all, so why monopolies arise? One thing it might happen that somebody might be having exclusive rights over the service or the resource. Okay, so for example, if we talk about kind of one example, suppose patent. If I have patent rights over a process or maybe product, then obviously I am the one who will be supplying that process or maybe who will be providing that process or maybe product in the market, in the entire market, right? So in that case, I become a monopoly. So I am the only one who will be providing that service or the product in the market. And since I am the one, I can decide on how much price I will actually charge from the consumers, from the buyers, right? I can do that. Of course, I cannot dictate or decide on two things simultaneously: the price and quantity to be sold in the market. If I decide on how much of price I'll be charging for a particular unit of the product. Probably the demand curve for that product will decide on how much the product is to be sold in the market. Because at higher price, the demand will be less. So how much demand will there be? So based on that, he can sell the product out there, right? So something like that. In the case of Indian Railways, so it's a kind of government-created monopoly. Government felt that the market is such, or maybe the facilities are to be provided to the customers, common customers, and if it is given at the hands of the private entrepreneurs, probably the prices will be very high, and the common people will not be in a position to pay for that. So that is why government felt that keeping it in the hands of the government is good from the point of view of overall welfare of the citizens. So that is why it's a kind of government created monopoly. But always it may not happen like that. Many a time, as you have pointed out, you talked about Microsoft, you talked about Coal India. So in many cases, it might so happen that okay, so maybe you might be starting as a monopolist, but later on, because of certain reasons, some others also might join. But again, there are issues out there. If the market is not very big, then too many players will not be able to sustain themselves. Okay, so it also happens so. If the market is smaller, and if you have too many players out there, nobody will be earning profit because the market is same, the demand will be less, and in that case, you cannot get profit out there. So that type of a thing might happen out there. But otherwise, also, even if it is not perfect monopoly or pure monopoly, even then, some kind of monopoly position might be enjoyed by some of the players out there. You have given the example of Jio, for example. So similarly, you have given the example of Coal India. In both the cases, so they are the market leaders. Since they are market leaders, they can dictate terms and conditions. Okay, so that type of a thing might happen, but this is not the case of pure monopoly, right? So in the case of pure monopoly, what happens? See, so when you talk about this markets should be successful, and the successful markets are those markets which actually ensure efficiency in the system. Efficiency we'll be discussing in those things a little bit later. It might be in the form of maybe a revenue, it might be in the form of profit, it might be in the form of consumer satisfaction. So many things are there out. So now, if that is ensured, then we can say that this is the best market or efficient market or successful market. If it is not there, we can say that the market is not functioning properly. Market is a failure out there. So that type of a thing might happen. So in between this perfectly competitive market structure, you see, in case of monopoly, what happens? There will be only one seller of one product, and the product is, you see, the same product is not available with other sellers. That is the problem. Okay, so that's why the monopolist can charge a unique price for the produce, and so nobody else can compete with him or her. That is the problem out there. So in between this perfectly competitive market structure and monopoly market, so there are a number of other markets, other forms. For example, we talk about monopolistic competition, we talk about oligopoly, we talk about duopoly. Just now, some of you have given the example of Jio. So now this network servicing market, if you look into, so there are a few players out there. It's not that too many players are there. A few players are there. For example, Airtel is there. Probably Vodafone is there. Okay, so Jio is there. A few are there. Now, this type of a market where a few players are playing the role, so that type of market can be considered to be oligopoly market. A few sellers will be there of a particular product. In the case of monopolistic competition, what happens? So it is the number of sellers in the market will be relatively large, no doubt, but it will not be that many as in the case of perfect competition. Okay. At the same time, there will be certain differences in the product that is